Number one, I'm not an expert in all of this stuff. So if you ask me difficult questions that neither I nor the team can answer, I will undertake to get back to you all on email. The reason being that different research managers wrote the different TORs, and we're not all in the room today. So I and my colleagues will do the best we can, but if there are any challenging technical questions, we will get back to you. Secondly, sorry, there's no like visually appealing way to do this in PowerPoint, so you'll see a lot of heavy text. I'm not going to go through it all in detail. You've got the documents in front of you. So I think I'll skim through it lightly, and then we can just deal with it on a kind of question and answer basis. So the first thing that I wanted to do was just to locate those 4 TORs within the overall vision and intent of the program. So the program is looking at a few things. It's looking at bringing big data and water resource management together, but more specifically, because there's a level of complexity beyond the national, that being the transboundary, we're looking at big data and water resource management in a transboundary context, because we know that that level has its own set of issues. So within that, what we did, so that central block in the slide is the kind of big vision, big picture of this collaboration overall. And what we did was we selected 4 chunks within that to focus on. And those 4 chunks are what you see presented in the terms of reference that are in front of you. And I think as we go through it, you'll see these are not watertight silos that have no overlap. They're not clear jurisdictions. You're going to see there are some areas of overlap between them. There are some grey zones. And for that reason, what we're saying is whoever gets these 4 projects is going to have to work quite collaboratively with the project teams doing the others. This is not a standalone, go off and do own thing kind of program. It's going to rely on a lot of coming together and figuring out how we operate in those grey zones, those zones of overlap, those zones of dependency between them. So the four areas, just to kind of summarize, I tried to summarize each of them in a phrase. There's one looking at consolidation and integration of data. That's recognizing what several people have already said today around how there's such fragmentation between the data that gets gathered within countries but for the same shared basin. Then there's a kind of visioning exercise that's looking forward to say, with these kind of emerging analytical tools that we have available, these big data approaches, what kind of things could we actually do to stretch the data we have further than we have ever thought we could previously? And that includes filling the gaps that might exist in the existing data. There's another one around looking at the data sets that we have and recognizing that many of these are quite coarse scale and have been quite aggregated. And if we are trying to make decisions around management of resources in an operational way at a local scale, what use are these coarse scale aggregated data sets to us? So there's another piece of work that's saying, these big data tools that we have available, how can they help to disaggregate or localize some of those big data sets to make that information useful at a local scale? And then the last one is around looking at groundwater. I think James painted a very compelling picture of the value and the role that groundwater plays in the region, the extent to which it's underutilized and understood, and how can we contribute to solving that problem. So that is really how those 4 fit into the overall picture. What I'll now do is I'll work through each of them in turn, starting with the consolidation of data. And like I said, I'm just going to skim over the details of there in your documents. Shanna, how are we going to run this? Are we going to take questions as they come, or are we going to hold questions till the end?
Let's maybe get through theme 1 and then pause for a moment. Does that make sense?
Good idea.
Great.
Okay, so basically incomplete, incompatible, fragmented data on transboundary water resources. I think that's a given. That's been said several times today. So we've got to improve the collation and integration if we're going to manage these shared resources in a sensible way. How can big data analytics help us with that? There are a number of objectives that are spelt out in the TOR. Sorry, I'm going to keep looking at the screen because I've just realized that my aging eyes are not... Can I make this any bigger here?
Screen it is.
Screen it is. There's an element of stock take of existing data sets. There's an element of working out ways of integrating those data sets, including designing quality control systems to do the integration, the collation, the collection of data. Protocols for standardizing how we collect data. For example, what parameters do we measure as country X compared to country Y when it's the same river and those parameters don't talk to each other? So how can we start to develop consistent approaches in how we collect data? And then start to look at shared repository for data on shared water resources, including not just the technical architecture, but some of the institutional stuff as well. So where would this thing be located? How would it work? Who would have access? Those kinds of more institutional or kind of data governance issues. There's things around from the data analytics side. What kind of data visualization tools could be developed specifically to help decision makers in how they engage with this data? And here's another of these areas of overlap, the localization, supporting localized decision making. So that falls across two of the TORs. What we normally as the WRC do to help our project proposers to get a sense of what it is we expect is we provide an indicative set of deliverables that we would want to see. That is not a prescriptive thing, so the proposers still have the flexibility to propose their own set of deliverables. Those deliverables are then tied to a budget, so it's a very important thing to do because we pay on deliverables, so the budget gets tied to payment milestones based on deliverables. So that's why I've said in brackets it's indicative. It's just to give you a sense of the types of things that we would need. These projects need to be very consultative and interactive by nature, so there's an element of workshopping, of engagement with stakeholders. In this particular one, we would want to see a deliverable around the form that the data repository would take, the visualization tools. A fairly standard set of deliverables for the WRC is a final project report that pulls together everything. So your report would typically be structured somewhere along the lines of those objectives. All those objectives would be covered in the final report. And because we're interested in taking the research beyond just the publication of a report, because we want to make sure that this gets embedded in policy, practice, ways of doing things. Things like policy briefs, where you're basically challenged to distill your research findings down into a 3 or 4 page document that talks to policymakers rather than talking to a more academic audience. So like I say, those are indicative deliverables, and you have the flexibility to structure your own depending on the approach that you would like to propose. We had a bit of, in addition to transport issues, we had a bit of a slide version issue. So please ignore the budget on the slide. You'll see it's not the same as the one in the TOR. The correct budget should be 1,855,000, 1,855,000.
In a nutshell, the exchange rate was very much on our side when the USA money came in. So
yeah, no, having a weak rand does sometimes work in our favour. So the budgets that are in the printed documents that you have are correct. Please ignore the one on the screen. Okay. Should we pause there?
Yeah, are there any questions at this point, or do you want John to run through the set before you start talking? Seems like you have silence as golden to continue.
Continue.
Good.
Right, the second one, so whereas the first one was very much about stock taking, looking at existing data, looking at how we can panel beat that into a shape that is more usable and shareable and interoperable. The second tier R is more of a imagining, visioning, horizon scanning type of exercise. That is really starting from a point of saying we have big data challenge. We have big data challenges, not big data challenges, but so not significant. Yeah, significant data. Thank you. We have significant challenges around data, and at the same time we have these new emerging analytical computational approaches, and we're starting to say, so what can these approaches do to help us solve or at least mitigate some of these seemingly intractable challenges that we're struggling with? And I guess these are by no means unique to our region, right? I think it's pretty much a global issue. So what novel opportunities are opening up that could help us to deal with some of these? And I think here it's particularly around two things. So it's around saying, how can we stretch the existing data that we have further than we have before? So what kind of stuff can we get out of our existing data before we even go and collect more data? How can these new tools help us to stretch the existing data further than we ever imagined possible? The other thing is around filling gaps. So let me move on to the objectives as I'm saying this. How can we start to fill gaps that might exist, whether those are issues around scale, geographical scale at which data is collected, time series, that kind of thing. And even things like what we call in the objectives, data from non-official sources. So I know in South Africa there's a very strong emerging focus on what we call citizen science. So this is data that's basically collected by non-scientists, still using standardized methods, but that are applicable by people who don't necessarily have formal scientific training to collect, for example, water quality data. The other big citizen science things that we do in this country are things like bird counts and bird atlasing. So it's kind of tapping into that experience. But then the challenge is, once that data is there, how do we pull that data into more formalized data sets where there might be some issues around quality control, consistency of that citizen science or that non-official data? And what we found is often it's those kinds of issues that can keep that very valuable data from being incorporated and integrated into the larger, more formal data sets. So what opportunities does the big data analytics offer to do some of that by, for example, developing mechanisms for quality controlling that data before it gets integrated? So it really is very much a visioning, horizon scanning exercise rather than a very detailed consolidating what we have. And I think you'll see the deliverables kind of mirror that as well, as far as keeping things reasonably flexible and really just presenting us with a set of opportunities, and then also saying what are the prerequisites. So if we identify this opportunity, what are the things that would need to be in place for us to actually to actualize, to get to that opportunity? So it's the types of prerequisites. And there as well, the budget was 1150, but on special offer for this month only is now going at 1,410,000. Okay, so it's 1,410. That's and all of these projects, by the way, are 18 months. So it's 18 months from start of contract. So that's theme 2. If there are no burning questions on theme 2, then I'll move on.
Jump up and interrupt if you need to, okay?
Right. The localizing, and again, this one has quite a strong groundwater flavor. I think for reasons that we've already discussed. As you've seen, there's a strong groundwater theme running through this whole program. So these last two TORs, theme 3 and theme 4, are very strongly groundwater oriented. Although theme 3 does allow for surface and groundwater. But the way the TOR was written by the research manager, it kind of starts out general and then gets very groundwater specific. So that's something that we might want to talk a bit about as we get into it. But we have these coarse scale aggregated data sets. At the same time, there are managers on the ground who need to make day-to-day decisions around managing these resources. How useful are those coarse scale aggregated data sets? Not very for those fine scale decisions. So this is all about looking at how we can start to disaggregate in a way that still maintains data integrity. So here we want to get quite specific around zooming in on case study areas. As you'll see in the last slide that I'm going to present, which kind of talks about the cross-cutting issues across all of these, there always needs to be a transboundary element. So we're not interested in looking at nationally or subnationally. We're only interested in case studies or examples that have some level of transboundary to them, at least 2 countries in other words. Looking at case studies, looking at the data parameters that the decision makers would be needing at that local scale for decision making, looking at how that matches with the coarse aggregated data that is available, developing the tools to do that kind of disaggregation, testing, and then looking at some element of how applicable that is more widely beyond that particular case study or case studies. There's a specific set of deliverables there that I won't go into. It's all listed, and the budget there is now 2,055,000.
Can I add something? I'm just busy thinking now while John's talking. You would have heard right at the beginning when we had that workshop right here at IBM almost 2 years ago now. And I think theme 1 and theme 3 really speak to the essence of some of the messages that came out of that workshop. And the first one, which is around theme 1, was about it's really difficult to find the data, right? And there's different rules around access of data. And it firstly kind of slows down the R&D process, but it also makes planning an incredibly difficult thing between countries. And so some of that challenge is being addressed by theme 1. But the second thing that came out incredibly clearly is the fact that part of the problem with transboundary work historically has been that although it informs a transboundary picture, it doesn't enable decision-making where decision-making happens, which is at the local level, at the level of the country, or at the level of the municipality, or whatever the space is where the decision-making gets made. So the experiment is here. How can you use a combination of local data sets and transboundary, more macro data sets to patch something together that enables effective decision-making where decisions get made? So it's those two kind of flip sides of the coin, just to kind of point out where we came from with all of this.
Thanks, Shannon. I think I would ask the rest of the collaboration if there's anything anyone would like to add as I go. Like I say, I'm hardly an expert on all of these, so please feel free to interject if there's any context or any detail that you think is important. Right, let's move to the last one, around groundwater secure transboundary systems. I think James summed it up very well in his slide talking about the 70% of the rural population in SADC that's reliant on groundwater, the 30 shared aquifers. But what's often missing is the local level systems for operating those aquifers, especially the shared ones, because of the additional level of transboundary complexity in a way that ensures sustainability and equity. So again, how can the big data angle contribute to improving the way in which we manage our shared groundwater systems? So again, there'll be an element of selecting case study or case studies, and then getting into a fair amount of detail around water budgets, looking at options around managed aquifer recharge, aquifer vulnerability maps. James, please feel free to add here, because this is a language that you're more comfortable with than me. Looking at remediation approaches in relation to contaminants that may be prevalent, but ultimately with a focus on sustainability, equity, redress, maybe that's more of a South African issue, I don't know, than other areas in the region. And packaging some of that stuff into strategies that can actually be taken forward by the authorities that manage these particular systems. So again, this one probably lends itself to a more specific set of deliverables because the objectives are quite specific. And maybe just to say the unique thing about this one, I think Sarah will get into that when she goes into the administrative side of it. It will happen slightly differently in that this one, the funding will come from SADC GMI, is that correct? So the contracting will be between SADC GMI and the project team, and WRC will still fit somewhere in there to helping to manage it. And the budget on that one is 1.3 million. Okay. So this is a last slide that all of the stuff is in the TORs, so there's nothing here that is not in the documents. But what we really wanted to do was emphasize a few issues around what will make your proposal stand out in relation to the other proposals that are received. And what are the things that are non-negotiable? So in other words, what are the prerequisites without which your proposal will not be competitive? So the first thing is that, as I mentioned at the start, these projects are complementary. So what will be required is some level of collaboration between the project teams. That may have its own set of challenges just depending on who gets appointed and where they are situated in the region, but it's something that we'll work through. But what we have set up is a set of activities in relation to the community of practice. So what your TOR talk about is making provision for attending at least 3 meetings of the community of practice. I think those are going to be in Johannesburg, we said, right here. So it's those types of things to make provision for, and those things will certainly assist with the type of integration that we're talking about. So you would need to budget accordingly for 3 of those meetings over the 18-month lifespan of the project here in Johannesburg. And what would the duration of those be? Did we ever 1 day, 2 day, 3 day? What are we talking?
We'll define it with you as we go along, but there will definitely be one of those workshops that will be between 2 and 3 days long, whereas the others would be 1 to 2 day workshops. And that you're going to hear more about that when we talk with USGS about their role in all of this.
Okay, we've spoken about the transboundary dimension. So by definition, this is a transboundary program, and you would need to have a transboundary focus. So those are the kind of musts. The things that will give you the edge in the way you structure your proposals are having a strong focus on groundwater. As you've seen, groundwater comes through very, very strongly. So preference will be given to those proposals that, while not excluding surface water, have a strong groundwater element. And because we're straddling disciplines here, we've got big data, analytical, computational stuff on one hand, and then we've got the water stuff on the other hand. You need both of those. One or the other is not going to do it. So we need to have both of those disciplines well represented in the skill set that the project team brings. One of the things that I forgot to say in my little ad-lib introduction to what is the WRC earlier was we have a very strong focus on capacity development. So part of our statutory mandate is to build capacity for water research in the country. And normally the way we do that is through building in studentships into all of our research projects. So we would normally very strongly suggest to our project proposers that they make provision for at least 1 or more postgrad students, usually master's level or higher, to be supported through the project and make provision in budget terms for the support of those students. Often what might happen is that a project may not be long enough to cover the full duration of a master's or a PhD. So it might support a component of that. I think the point is that the project can support the academic and professional development of those young professionals as they engage with the project in whatever capacity. So we would certainly look very strongly, and I think if we had two equally capable proposals technically and one was stronger on capacity development than the other, it would certainly give it an edge over the other one. And then because this is, there's an element of breaking new ground here, of scanning the horizons and combining things that haven't been combined historically, we're looking for those creative novel elements that haven't necessarily been considered before. The other thing that you'll see in your TOR is IBM has kindly made provision for one individual per project to participate in an internship here at the IBM office in Johannesburg. And I think John will probably be able to speak in more detail to that. And we can also talk about what provision you would need to make in budget terms. In other words, what that internship would cover and what it wouldn't cover. But that is an additional, I wouldn't say it's an instead of students, I would say it's an in addition to students around capacity development.